The crew chiefs stopped making eye contact during pre-flight inspections. Strange, considering these were the same men who would argue for 30 minutes about a loose panel or questionable hydraulic pressure reading, men whose entire purpose centered on keeping pilots alive through mechanical perfection. But when Frederick Allen reached for the equipment bag that should have contained his parachute harness, Technical Sergeant Raymond Martinez simply handed over a canvas sack 20 pounds lighter than it should have been, and turned away without his usual detailed commentary about aircraft status. Every pilot noticed it. None of them asked why. And that silence, that collective agreement not to question what was missing, carried more weight than any briefing officer would ever acknowledge in official communications. December 1952 marked the darkest phase of air combat over the Korean Peninsula, a conflict that had evolved from a United Nations police action into a brutal proxy war between American technological superiority and Soviet-trained Chinese pilots flying the most advanced jet fighter in the communist arsenal. The stretch of airspace along the Yalu River, which separated North Korea from Manchuria, had earned the nickname MiG Alley among American pilots who flew bombing runs into what had become the most dangerous piece of sky in the world. Chinese MiG-15 fighters operated from bases across the river in Manchuria, sanctuaries that American forces were officially forbidden to attack, despite the fact that every pilot knew these bases launched the interceptors that killed their squadrons daily. The political calculus that governed the war demanded that the United States maintain the fiction of a limited conflict while simultaneously prosecuting an air campaign that routinely violated Chinese airspace, struck targets deep inside Manchuria, and engaged Soviet advisors who flew combat missions under Chinese colors. Captain Frederick Allen had joined the 58th Fighter Bomber Wing at Daegu Air Base in South Korea 6 months earlier, carrying combat experience from 47 missions over Nazi Germany, where he had flown P-47 Thunderbolts against Luftwaffe interceptors defending the industrial heartland of the Third Reich. The transition from propeller-driven fighters to the Republic F-84 Thunderjet had required 3 months of intensive training at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, where instructors emphasized the jet's ground attack capabilities, while carefully avoiding discussion of its significant disadvantages in air-to-air combat against the Soviet-designed MiG-15. Allen had lost his younger brother Robert over Schweinfurt in 1943 when a direct flak hit destroyed his B-17 before the crew could bail out. An experience that had driven Frederick to volunteer for every dangerous mission offered, as if accumulating risk could somehow balance the cosmic ledger that had taken his brother while Frederick survived. His personnel file noted exceptional gunnery scores and a troubling tendency to extend missions beyond safe fuel margins, characteristics that made him valuable for the specific type of operations that required both skill and a certain indifference to survival odds. The morning briefing for Mission 237 Alpha had covered the standard tactical parameters for a fighter-bomber strike against railroad infrastructure near Sinuiju, a North Korean city that sat directly across the Yalu River from the Chinese city of Dandong. Allen's 4-ship flight would carry 2,000-pound bombs and full ammunition loads for their 6 50-caliber machine guns, with orders to destroy a rail bridge that intelligence reported was being used to move supplies from Manchuria into North Korea under cover of darkness. The mission commander had spent 15 minutes reviewing the bridge's structural vulnerabilities and acceptable approach angles, then exactly 45 seconds on the weight restrictions that prohibited pilots from carrying standard emergency equipment, including parachutes. The official explanation, which Allen had heard on 22 previous missions, emphasized fuel requirements and bomb loads that pushed the F-84 to its maximum takeoff weight. Nobody mentioned the 3 pilots from the 49th Fighter Bomber Wing who had disappeared over similar targets in the past month, or the intelligence reports that suggested they had not died in their cockpits. Allen walked across the frozen tarmac toward his aircraft, feeling the absence of the parachute harness that should have pressed against his shoulders and restricted his movement in the cramped cockpit. The December wind cut through his flight suit, despite the heated underlayer, carrying the smell of jet fuel and engine exhaust across an airfield that operated around the clock to support missions that the Pentagon simultaneously ordered and officially denied. His crew chief, Technical Sergeant Raymond Martinez, had already completed the pre-flight inspection and stood waiting beside the F-84's access ladder with the canvas bag that contained Alan's emergency gear. Flares, a first aid kit, water purification tablets, a survival radio, and a .45 caliber pistol with 2 magazines. Martinez handed over the bag without meeting Alan's eyes, a departure from his usual detailed commentary on the aircraft's mechanical status. The sergeant had maintained Alan's Thunderjet through 22 previous missions and had developed the superstitious habits common among ground crews who watched pilots they knew personally fly into situations that produced empty cockpits and wreckage scattered across enemy territory. The engine's start sequence proceeded normally, the Allison J-35 turbojet building thrust with the characteristic whine that distinguished American jets from the deeper rumble of Soviet designs. Alan completed his instrument checks, while the other 3 aircraft in his flight fired up their engines in sequence, their pilots running through identical procedures that had been drilled into muscle memory through countless repetitions. The control tower cleared the flight for takeoff, and Alan advanced the throttle, feeling the Thunderjet accelerate down the runway with a sluggishness that came from carrying maximum fuel and ordnance. The aircraft lifted off, with less than 500 feet of runway remaining, climbing into the grey December sky that promised snow before nightfall. 22 minutes into the flight, Alan's wingman called out the first MiG contact. 4 contacts, high and fast, coming down from Manchurian airspace. The Chinese fighters had launched from bases that American forces could not touch, would intercept over North Korean territory where engagement was authorized, then retreat across the river where pursuit meant court-martial for any pilot who followed. Alan checked his fuel state and ran the calculations that every fighter-bomber pilot learned to hate. Enough fuel to reach the target, deliver ordnance, and return to base. Not enough for extended combat maneuvering against fighters that could outclimb, outturn, and outrun the bomb-laden Thunderjets. The MiGs dove through 20,000 feet. Alan saw the lead fighter's nose light up with cannon fire. His number 3 aircraft exploded. No ejection, no parachute, no time to process that Jerry Morrison had just ceased to exist. The formation broke hard left, bombs away early. Survival became the only mission parameter that mattered. Alan's aircraft shuddered as he released both 1,000-pounders, reducing weight for the maneuvers that might keep him alive through the next 60 seconds. Cannon rounds walked across his right wing. Metal screamed. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his canopy. The stick went mushy, flight controls compromised, engine temperature climbing into the red. Alan dove for the deck, trading altitude for speed he did not have, running calculations about glide ratios and distance to friendly territory. The numbers did not work. They had never worked. That was the point of the weight restrictions. That was why the parachute stayed behind. The F-84 Thunderjet lost altitude at 300 feet per minute, a descent rate that gave Frederick Allen approximately 4 minutes before impact with the frozen Korean landscape that stretched below him in shades of white and grey. The hydraulic system that controlled his primary flight surfaces had lost pressure through the holes that Chinese cannon rounds had punched through his right wing, leaving him with degraded elevator authority and almost no aileron response. The engine continued to run, despite temperatures that exceeded operational limits by 50 degrees, turbine blades spinning at speeds that would eventually cause catastrophic failure when the metal reached its structural breaking point. Alan had survived 7 years of combat flying by developing an instinctive understanding of how machines failed, and every indicator on his instrument panel told him that his aircraft had perhaps 90 seconds of controlled flight remaining before it transitioned from a damaged airplane into a ballistic object, following the laws of gravity toward the ground. The survival manual that every pilot memorized outlined specific procedures for emergency situations, including forced landings, bailout sequences, and water ditching. But those procedures assumed the presence of functional equipment, including a parachute that would arrest a pilot's descent and deliver him to the ground at survivable speeds. Alan had flown 22 previous missions without that equipment, accepting the official explanation that weight restrictions made such precautions impossible, never questioning why those same restrictions did not apply to fighter escort missions or high-altitude reconnaissance flights that operated at similar weights and altitudes. The absence of the parachute had seemed like just another calculated risk in a war that demanded such calculations daily. One more factor to consider alongside fuel margins and ammunition loads and the probability of encountering enemy fighters over hostile territory. Now, with his aircraft disintegrating around him and the ground rising to meet him at terminal velocity, the weight restriction revealed itself as something other than a technical limitation. His radio crackled with transmissions from his surviving wingmen, who had broken off engagement with the MiGs and were climbing back towards safer altitude over the Yellow Sea. Lieutenant Robert Chen, flying as Alan's number 2, called out coordinates and requested rescue assets, following standard procedures that assumed a downed pilot would survive ejection and require extraction from enemy territory. Alan did not correct him, did not explain that there would be no ejection and no extraction, because saying those words over an open radio channel would require acknowledging the policy that had removed his parachute, and with it, any possibility of surviving a catastrophic aircraft failure. The silence that followed Chen's transmission carried its own weight, a recognition shared among pilots who understood what the missing parachute meant, but had learned not to discuss it in official communications that were recorded and reviewed by intelligence officers who served priorities that had nothing to do with pilot survival. The Thunderjet's nose dropped despite Alan's efforts to maintain level flight, aerodynamic forces overwhelming the limited control authority that remained in his damaged control surfaces. He scanned the terrain below for anything that might offer a survivable crash-landing opportunity, searching for frozen rice paddies or snow-covered fields that would absorb impact energy better than the rocky hills and frozen rivers that dominated the landscape. The North Korean winter had transformed the countryside into a monochrome wilderness where distinguishing safe landing zones from fatal ones required judgment that Alan had to make at altitude while managing an aircraft that fought every control input. He identified a valley, approximately 2 miles ahead, where agricultural terraces created relatively flat surfaces, though the snow cover made it impossible to determine if those surfaces concealed irrigation ditches or stone walls that would rip apart an aircraft attempting a wheels-up landing. Alan committed to the approach, dropping his landing gear to increase drag and slow his descent rate, even though the damaged hydraulic system meant the gear would not lock properly and would likely collapse on contact with the ground. The engine temperature gauge had climbed past its maximum reading and now provided no useful information except the certainty that turbine failure was imminent rather than merely probable. He armed his guns and fired a short burst into empty air, expending ammunition that would add weight to the nose during impact and potentially start fires if the rounds cooked off in the crash. Every action now served the singular purpose of maximizing his chances of surviving the next 60 seconds, a window that was closing with mathematical precision. The MiGs reappeared. 2 of them. They had circled back after the main engagement, either hunting for damaged stragglers or deliberately waiting to observe what happened to American pilots who went down over territory that the United States officially claimed not to be operating over. Allen watched them take up positions 500 feet above and behind him, matching his descent rate, close enough that he could see the red stars painted on their fuselages and the canopy reflections that suggested the pilots were watching him rather than preparing for another gun run. The Chinese fighters did not attack. They observed. They documented. They waited to see where the American pilot would come down and whether he would survive to be collected by the recovery teams that operated in this contested airspace. The valley rushed up to meet him. Allen pulled back on the stick with both hands, using his remaining elevator authority to flare the nose up and reduce his sink rate in the final seconds before impact. The Thunderjet's tail touched first, absorbing energy through structural failure, as the rear fuselage crumpled according to designs that prioritized pilot survival over aircraft preservation. The main gear made contact and collapsed immediately, dropping the belly onto frozen ground that scraped away external fuel tanks and tore off the ventral gun compartment. Metal shrieked against rock and ice. The canopy shattered. Freezing air flooded the cockpit. Allen's head snapped forward against his harness as the aircraft decelerated from 120 knots to 0 in less than 3 seconds. Silence followed. Then the smell of leaking fuel. Then the realization that he had survived. Frederick Allen unbuckled his harness with hands that shook from adrenaline rather than fear, pulled himself from the wreckage, and ran toward the tree line 50 yards away. Behind him, the 2 Chinese MiGs made a low pass over the crash site. Ahead, figures emerged from the forest. Not rescue, not friendly, something worse. They wore American flight suits. They carried no weapons. They walked with the mechanical precision of men who had been broken and reprogrammed. One of them raised his hand in greeting, and Allen recognized the face from briefing room photographs. Captain James Morrison, missing in action, presumed dead, very much alive, very much not returning home. Captain James Morrison walked with the careful steps of a man who had learned that sudden movements produced consequences, his gait suggesting injury that had healed incorrectly, or perhaps psychological damage that manifested in physical caution. Frederick Allen had seen Morrison's photograph 3 weeks earlier during a classified briefing where intelligence officers displayed images of pilots listed as missing in action, their fates unknown but presumed fatal, based on the standard calculus that governed air combat attrition rates. Morrison had disappeared during a bombing run near Antung on November 14th. His F-84 Thunderjet last observed trailing smoke after taking cannon fire from Chinese MiG interceptors that had pursued him across the Yalu River into Manchurian airspace, where American rescue operations could not follow. The official casualty report had listed him as killed in action after search efforts failed to locate wreckage or receive emergency radio transmissions, a determination that allowed the Air Force to close his file and notify his family that their son had died serving his country in combat operations over North Korea. The man approaching through the snow-covered tree line bore Morrison's face and wore Morrison's flight suit, but something fundamental had changed in the 6 weeks since his disappearance, an alteration that went beyond the physical evidence of captivity such as weight loss or visible injuries. Morrison's eyes tracked Allen with the mechanical precision of someone following instructions rather than exercising independent judgment, and his expression carried none of the relief or excitement that would naturally accompany encountering a fellow American pilot in enemy territory. 2 other men flanked Morrison at precise intervals, both wearing flight suits that identified them as U.S. Air Force personnel, both moving with the same rehearsed coordination that suggested extensive conditioning rather than military discipline. Allen recognized the second man as Lieutenant David Park, reported missing on November 27th after his aircraft suffered engine failure during a reconnaissance mission over the Chosin Reservoir. The third man remained unidentified, his name patch removed, his rank insignia missing, his face carrying the blank expression of someone who had stopped processing external reality through any recognizable human framework. Alan's hand moved toward the .45 caliber pistol holstered at his hip, a reflexive action driven by the wrongness of the scene rather than any specific threat assessment. Morrison raised both hands in a gesture that mimicked surrender, but felt more like theatrical performance, his movements too precise and his timing too calculated to represent genuine human reaction to a weapon being drawn. The Chinese MiG fighters circled overhead at low altitude, their presence transforming what might have appeared as a rescue encounter into something closer to a staged demonstration, a carefully orchestrated presentation designed for an audience that Alan could not yet identify. Morrison spoke in English that carried no accent, but somehow sounded foreign. Each word enunciated with textbook precision that eliminated the natural rhythm and regional variations that characterized actual human speech patterns. Morrison explained that resistance would prove counterproductive. Chinese recovery teams were approaching from multiple directions with orders to secure the crash site and transport all personnel to a processing facility located 12 kilometers north of their current position. Alan would receive medical evaluation, food, warm clothing, and an opportunity to make contact with Red Cross representatives who could facilitate his eventual repatriation through established prisoner exchange protocols. The monologue continued for 90 seconds without pause or variation in tone, covering topics ranging from the Geneva Convention protections afforded to captured military personnel to the nutritional content of standard prisoner rations. Morrison delivered this information with the flat affect of someone reciting memorized text, never acknowledging the shared history that should have existed between two American pilots who had flown from the same airbase and attended the same briefings. Alan interrupted with questions about Morrison's capture, his treatment during captivity, and the circumstances that had brought him to this specific location at this specific time. Morrison responded to each query with additional memorized statements that provided information without conveying meaning, descriptions of detention facilities and interrogation procedures that sounded accurate in their specifics, but entirely disconnected from any emotional reality. Lieutenant Park remained silent throughout the exchange, his eyes focused on some point beyond Alan's shoulder, his posture suggesting he was waiting for specific cues before initiating whatever action his conditioning had programmed him to execute. The third pilot never moved, never blinked, never showed any indication of awareness that the conversation was occurring in his presence. The sound of truck engines approached through the forest, diesel motors struggling against the winter cold and rough terrain. Chinese soldiers emerged from the trees in tactical formation, their weapons carried at ready positions but not actively aimed at Alan, their movements suggesting this was a recovery operation rather than a combat engagement. A Soviet-built Gaz truck stopped 30 meters from the crash site, and an officer dismounted carrying a leather document case that seemed incongruous with the military operation unfolding around him. The officer wore Chinese People's Volunteer Army insignia, but spoke English with a distinct Moscow accent, his linguistic background revealing the Soviet advisory presence that officially did not exist in this theater of operations. The officer introduced himself as Major Volkov and explained that Alan's aircraft had violated Chinese airspace during unauthorized bombing operations against civilian infrastructure, actions that constituted war crimes under international law and justified his detention as a criminal combatant rather than a legitimate prisoner of war. The accusations came with supporting documentation, including reconnaissance photographs that showed Alan's flight path extending 40 kilometers into Manchurian territory, radio intercepts of mission briefings that explicitly discussed targets inside China, and a prepared confession statement that required only Alan's signature to complete the legal framework for his public trial. Volkov described the trial schedule, the expected testimony from other captured American pilots who would corroborate the pattern of illegal incursions, and the international press coverage that would document American aggression against a sovereign nation that had not declared war against the United States. Allen understood. The missing parachutes, the weight restrictions that never made technical sense, the 3 pilots who walked like programmed machines. The Pentagon had not removed the parachutes to save weight. They had removed them to ensure that pilots who went down over prohibited territory would die in the crash, rather than survive to be captured, interrogated, and displayed in show trials that would provide evidence of American violations of Chinese sovereignty. Every pilot who flew without a parachute carried not just bombs and ammunition, but also the implicit mission parameter that survival was less important than maintaining plausible deniability about operations that the United States government would never acknowledge conducting. Morrison stepped forward and offered Allen the pen. The confession waited. The cameras were already positioned. 23 missions without a parachute. And this was why. This was always why. Frederick Allen stared at the pen, extended in James Morrison's hand, and calculated probabilities with the same methodical precision he had applied to fuel consumption rates and ammunition expenditure during 7 years of combat operations. The mathematics of survival had always been simple enough to process under stress, equations that balanced risk against reward and produced clear answers about when to engage and when to break contact. This calculation involved different variables that produced no clean solutions, only choices between forms of defeat that would serve purposes beyond his personal survival or death. Signing the confession would confirm Chinese accusations of American airspace violations and provide documented evidence for propaganda campaigns that would undermine United States credibility throughout Asia. Refusing to sign would trigger interrogation procedures that Major Volkov had described with clinical detachment, methods that had transformed Morrison and Park into the automated beings who now stood waiting for Allen to make his selection. The broader strategic implications of either choice extended far beyond Allen's individual fate and connected to political considerations that existed at levels where colonels and generals made decisions based on calculations that treated pilots as expendable resources rather than human beings with families and futures. The removal of parachutes from fighter-bomber missions over contested airspace represented a policy decision that prioritized maintaining plausible deniability about unauthorized military operations over preserving the lives of the men who conducted those operations. Every pilot who flew without a parachute accepted mortality as the price of mission completion. But that acceptance had been predicated on the assumption that death would come quickly through combat or catastrophic mechanical failure, rather than through capture, followed by psychological destruction in service of enemy propaganda objectives. The 3 men standing before Allen demonstrated what happened to pilots who survived crashes in territory where the Pentagon had calculated they should die. Their transformation into propaganda tools, revealing the actual purpose behind weight restrictions that had never made technical sense. Morrison continued holding the pen with mechanical patience that suggested he could maintain the posture indefinitely, his conditioning having eliminated normal human responses to physical discomfort or social awkwardness. Lieutenant Park had moved closer during the extended silence, positioning himself to physically restrain Allen if the situation required intervention, his body language displaying none of the hesitation that would normally precede using force against a fellow American officer. The 3rd pilot remained motionless at the edge of Allen's peripheral vision, his presence serving as a preview of what extended captivity and specialized interrogation would eventually produce if Allen chose resistance over compliance. Major Volkov had returned to the truck to retrieve additional documentation, leaving the captured American pilots to manage the immediate situation through whatever methods their conditioning dictated. a delegation of authority that suggested confidence in the reliability of the psychological programming they had undergone. Alan's thoughts returned to Technical Sergeant Martinez and the way his crew chief had avoided eye contact when handing over the equipment bag that lacked the parachute that should have been standard issue for combat missions over enemy territory. Martinez had maintained Alan's aircraft through 22 previous missions and had developed the superstitions and rituals common among ground personnel who watched pilots they knew disappear into hostile airspace and sometimes not return. The sergeant's refusal to meet Alan's eyes during the final pre-flight inspection suggested knowledge that he could not articulate, awareness of a policy he could not discuss, complicity in a system that demanded silence about the true purpose behind equipment restrictions. Every person in the operational chain, from mechanics to mission commanders to Pentagon planners, understood at some level that the missing parachutes served purposes unrelated to aircraft performance, but maintaining the fiction required collective participation in a conspiracy of silence that protected political interests while condemning pilots to deaths that served strategic rather than tactical objectives. The confession document that waited for Alan's signature contained 19 pages of detailed accusations supported by photographic evidence, radio intercepts, and witness statements from other captured pilots who had already signed similar documents. Volkov had explained that the trial would occur in Beijing with international press coverage and simultaneous translation into 17 languages for global distribution through communist media networks. Alan's testimony would corroborate existing evidence of American aggression and provide human context to abstract accusations about imperialist military adventurism in Asia. The document's specificity suggested months of preparation and indicated that Alan's capture represented not an opportunistic exploitation of random chance, but rather the successful execution of a planned operation that had anticipated American pilots surviving crashes in prohibited territory and being available for this exact purpose. Alan dropped his hand away from his holstered pistol and considered the futility of armed resistance against the Chinese soldiers who had established a perimeter around the crash site with professional efficiency. The .45 caliber pistol carried 7 rounds in its magazine, plus 1 in the chamber, sufficient ammunition to kill perhaps 3 or 4 soldiers before return fire ended the engagement, along with Alan's life. Suicide by combat represented one available option that would prevent interrogation and eliminate the possibility of his eventual appearance in a Chinese courtroom. But that choice would also confirm for observers that American pilots preferred death to capture specifically because they carried knowledge of unauthorized operations that their government could not acknowledge. Morrison and Park and the nameless third pilot had presumably faced similar calculations and made different choices that had led them through interrogation and conditioning to their current states of psychological destruction. The sound of additional vehicles approaching through the forest indicated that the recovery operation was expanding beyond the immediate crash site, Chinese forces securing the area with a thoroughness that suggested they anticipated either rescue attempts or additional American aircraft attempting to verify Alan's status. Major Volkov returned carrying a portable film camera and battery-powered lighting equipment, the tools necessary to document Alan's confession for the propaganda purposes that justified the entire operation. The Major directed Chinese soldiers to position the lighting units to eliminate shadows that would reduce image quality, his attention to cinematographic details revealing familiarity with media production standards that went beyond basic military documentation procedures. Morrison spoke again, his voice maintaining the same effectless tone that characterized all his communication since emerging from the tree line. He explained that cooperation would result in humane treatment and eventual repatriation through prisoner exchange programs. Resistance would produce outcomes that Morrison could describe in clinical detail based on personal experience that had taught him the specific methodologies that Chinese interrogators employed when working with subjects who maintained adversarial postures. The description lasted 4 minutes and covered physiological and psychological techniques that had been refined through decades of communist security apparatus development. Morrison delivered this information without emotion or apparent awareness that he was describing torture procedures that had been applied to him personally. Allen recognized the trap. Signing the confession would betray his country and undermine American strategic objectives throughout the Korean theater. Refusing to sign would lead to interrogation that would eventually produce the same confession, along with additional admissions extracted through methods designed to break human will. The missing parachute had been meant to prevent exactly this situation by ensuring that pilots who went down over prohibited territory would die rather than survive to face choices between immediate betrayal and eventual psychological destruction. Allen had survived the crash through skill and luck that the policymakers had not anticipated, and his survival now presented problems for strategists in both Washington and Beijing, who had planned for cleaner outcomes. He looked at Morrison one final time and saw not a fellow pilot, but a warning about what resistance would ultimately cost. Then Allen made his choice. He took the pen. The cameras began recording. Major Volkov smiled, and somewhere in a Pentagon briefing room, officers who had written the policy that removed parachutes from fighter-bomber missions over Manchuria would learn that their calculations about acceptable losses had failed to account for the one variable that consistently defeated even the most carefully constructed strategic planning. Some pilots survived when they were supposed to die. And survival, it turned out, carried costs that exceeded any weight restriction.